This is the prologue to my book, The Shampe, Terror Has a Name. This book is a Bigfoot horror story that's setting is in the mountains of southeast Oklahoma. If you would like to purchase this book and read it in its entirety, I will leave a link in the description in which you can do so. I hope you will enjoy this small part of the book as I read it. The Shampe is awakened from his slumber among the thick underbrush of the river bottoms to the sound of a bulldozer as it pushes its way through the trees of his domain. Opening his eyes, he slowly rises to his full height. Standing upright in his slightly stooping fashion, he is an impressive 8 feet tall. Covered from head to toe with black, matted hair, his large, slightly peaked head sits almost flat atop massively wide shoulders. Small black eyes stare malevolently from beneath the prominent brow ridge of his sloping forehead. Long, powerfully muscled arms end with immense 5-fingered hands that reach nearly to his knees. He is a truly terrifying sight to behold as he stands among the dense vegetation of the forest. Staring in the direction of the noise of crashing trees and the revving engine of the bulldozer, the giant parts his lips in a silent snarl, exposing eye teeth that are considerably longer than the rest. Cautiously, unaccustomed to the sounds of man's machinery invading the solitude of his home, the Shampe begins to make his way toward the distant sounds of machine and crashing trees. Despite his considerable size, he moves swiftly through the timber, making surprisingly little noise as he glides effortlessly through the underbrush. As he nears the source of the commotion that disturbed his sleep, he stops and peers from behind the trunk of a large pine tree. He observes the bulldozer as it pushes through the trees of his home. The man operating the bulldozer, oblivious to the monster lurking in the darkness of the nearby timber, stops the machine and kills the engine. Taking off his hard hat and wiping the sweat from his forehead, he reaches under his seat to retrieve his lunchbox. Taking out a sandwich and biting into it, he surveys the forest ahead of him, thinking about how much further he will get today, clearing paths to the many proposed fishing and camping locations he has been charged with completing. The path he is clearing now will take him to the edge of a creek where he plans to clear a small area for fishermen and hunters to camp. When he completes that goal, he plans on calling it a day and heading home. The valley is not scheduled to officially open for at least another year. In the interim, it will be accessible for anyone with a more adventurous spirit who wants to take advantage of this pristine wilderness before the bulk of tourists begin to arrive. From his hiding place among the trees, the Shampe glares hatefully at the man sitting in the cab of the bulldozer. He contemplates sneaking up behind the machine, killing the man, and carrying his body back to his lair to feed. He remembers well the taste of human flesh and desires greatly to feed on it once more. At the same time, he fears the big, noisy machine that can so easily push through the ancient trees of the forest as if they are no more than twigs. The Shampe remembers the first time, years before, when he had stood astounded at the edge of a vast clear-cut bordering his home, where seemingly endless woodlands had once stood. He had been stunned, unable to comprehend the unbridled destructive capability that the human species possessed. In the past, he had occasionally observed people cutting timber with axes and hand saws to construct their homes or to build their fires, but this was unprecedented. Whoever had done this had cut down and taken all of the largest trees of the forest, then piled up and burned what was left, leaving a huge barren scar on the land. And now, years later, the first of man's machines of destruction was making its way into his, until now, untouched valley. Crouching low among the trees, the monster moved forward, cautiously stalking his intended prey. The enormous machine is silent now. Surely if this great destroyer of the forest is sleeping, he reasons, it cannot harm him. The Shampe begins to make his way through the forest around the bulldozer, trying to achieve an angle of surprise from which to attack the man unaware. His motives are twofold. One is purely territorial, to kill the one who had dared to violate his borders. The second is for food. While the Shampe is contemplating his method of attack, the man suddenly puts down his lunch and climbs down from the bulldozer to relieve himself. The monster is some 20 yards away from his intended victim, concealed within the cover of the dense timber. The Shampe begins to slowly make his way through the underbrush toward his intended victim. The man is totally unaware of his presence and presents what should be an easy target. But then a memory comes back to the monster that causes the giant to stop in his tracks. The machine may be silent and harmless now, but he remembers that men, small and weak as they are, can also be very dangerous. The Shampe slowly reaches up and traces the deep scar that runs through the dark flesh of his right cheek, thinking back to the time that he almost met his end at the hands of a man. He remembered the time several years ago when a hunter had ventured into the edge of his territory to hunt for deer. With his highly developed sense of smell, he had detected the scent of the man as soon as he had crossed over the ridge into his territory. Not one to suffer such an intrusion, he had immediately begun stalking the trespasser. From the cover of the thick forest, the Shampe had stealthily followed the intruder as he walked through the timber. Careful not to betray his presence, the ogre-like creature crouched low in the brush and watched silently as the hunter stopped at the edge of a small clearing and sat down under a tree to wait for a deer to, hopefully, walk into his line of fire. Having never encountered a man with a gun before, the Shampe thought this should be an easy kill. He stepped from the cover of the trees and approached his intended victim straight on, unconcerned that so small a creature could possibly defend itself against one such as himself. Startled, the man looked up, both surprised and utterly terrified by the giant black apparition that suddenly appeared before him. The monster walked swiftly toward him in a strange, gliding fashion from the opposite side of the small clearing. The monster covered the distance between himself and the hunter incredibly fast, and was just reaching down to snatch him up when the man gave an involuntary shout. He frantically raised his rifle and fired a shot at the horror that towered over him. The bullet from the high-powered firearm had deeply grazed the cheek of the Shampe. The loud retort of the rifle blast, followed by the shearing pain in his right cheek, had caused him to reel backward, his hand instinctively going up to his injured face. The monster let loose an ear-splitting scream as he turned away from the man, nearly falling to the ground as he ran back into the dense timber from which he had been hiding. The monster had swiftly retreated deep into the swampy interior of the valley floor toward his hidden abode. Overwhelmed by pain and confusion, he had removed his hand from his injured cheek and looked in shock and disbelief at the blood that filled his palm. Never before had an intended victim fought back so effectively against him, much less with such a weapon as this. On most occasions, whether animal or human, his victims were generally so paralyzed with fear on seeing the giant that they froze in their tracks as he grabbed them up and snapped their necks. He had run deep into the sloughs of the old river bottoms to his lair of tangled vines, river cane, and broken tree limbs. Sitting down inside, he had packed mud into the wound on his cheek to soothe the terrible throbbing pain. Silently, he had brooded over his encounter that had nearly, very nearly, ended his long and solitary life. The hunter, badly shaken, had run as fast as he could through the timber toward his truck. Rifle at the ready, he did not dare take his eyes off the encroaching trees as he had fled, hoping that the beast would not regain its composure and can pursue him. The hunter had heard the giant roar in pain as it ran crashing through the woods away from him. This gave him some small relief. At least it was going in the opposite direction. But as the man ran, an unsettling thought came into his mind. What if that thing wasn't alone? As he ran through the thick brush and ancient towering trees, he prayed that there was not another one of these monsters out there, perhaps even now, silently pursuing him. After what seemed like an eternity of running through the endless forest, the hunter reached the top of the ridge he had crossed earlier. Unmolested and safe, he breathlessly made it back to his vehicle. He was shaking so badly that he dropped his keys twice. The hunter fumbled, trying to unlock his pickup door with one hand and hold his rifle at the ready with the other. Cursing loudly, nearly out of his mind with terror, he had finally succeeded on the third try. Jerking the door open and throwing his rifle into the passenger seat, he had jumped in while slamming the door shut behind him at the same time. Jamming his truck into gear and flooring the accelerator, he sprayed dirt in all directions as he spun his vehicle around, clipping a tree and knocking a rearview mirror off in the process. Speeding along the narrow trail, he had not dared to slow down until he reached the main road. Once he had reached pavement, and he finally allowed himself to slow down to a safer speed, he had wept uncontrollably, realizing just how close he had come to losing his life. The man had no idea how badly he had wounded the monster. For all he knew, it had gone deeper into the forest and died. He hoped that that was the case. Regardless, he would not go back at any time for any amount of money into that haunted valley to look. He decided not to report what had happened to him to the authorities, thinking that they would not believe him and possibly even ridicule him. The only person he told was his wife. Seeing how badly shaken he was, she chose not to question him, nor did she doubt his story. It would be several weeks before the man would be able to sleep without waking up from nightmares. Every night during that time he would awake, often screaming in terror, soaked in sweat. His wife did her best to comfort him. The nightmare was always the same. He was back in the woods, sitting under the tree in the dawn's dim light, looking across the small clearing and hoping to get a shot at a deer. Then, from the opposite tree line, the beast materialized from the gloom. It walked swiftly and silently toward him through the early morning mist, covering the distance impossibly fast. The hulking black giant leaned forward as it drew near, massive arms reaching down for him. But in the dream, when he raised his rifle and pulled the trigger, his rifle would misfire. The monster would reach down, lift him off the ground like a child's toy and crush the life out of him, all the while staring into his face with small, soulless black eyes. For the rest of his life, the man would never again go into the woods by himself, and seldom even with a companion. Hunting was out of the question, as was any other activity that would require him to go into the forest alone. His close friends questioned him as to his sudden loss of interest in an activity he had so dearly loved all of his life. One person had jokingly asked him, "What's wrong? Did you see a monster out in the woods or something?" The man simply shrugged and said something to the effect that he just wasn't interested anymore. The memory of being shot still fresh in his mind after all this time, 20 years to be exact, the Shampe stared maliciously at the man who stood beside the bulldozer with his back to him. Grinding his teeth and clenching his massive fists, he wanted nothing more than to rush from the cover of the forest, grab the man up, and snap his neck. He contemplated doing just that. It had been many years since he had tasted human flesh. But what if this man had a terrible weapon like the hunter of so long ago? The Shampe may not be so lucky this time. He let out a long whistle of frustration and retreated back into the darkness of the timber, making his way into the dark creek bottoms that had been his home for so many years. The man, having finished relieving himself, heard the strange whistle of the giant as it returned to the depths of the forest. He stood beside the bulldozer, staring into the encroaching trees in front of him. He thought for a moment that he saw a dark shadow moving away through the underbrush. He strained his eyes, trying to make out what it was that he saw in the gloom of the timber, but the underbrush was so thick that it was impossible to see more than a few feet into the tree line. He rubbed his eyes and thought to himself how easy it was to imagine all kinds of things lurking in the woods out here in the middle of nowhere, especially when you're alone. He laughed out loud as he climbed back onto the machine and put away his lunchbox, thinking to himself that he had probably seen one of the many black bear that inhabited the area as it went about its daily business. But what about that strange whistling call? He hadn't imagined that, and a bear didn't make such a noise. He frowned, staring once more into the woods. He had never heard anything quite like that sound. It didn't sound like a bird, but it didn't sound like a person whistling either. Taking one last look into the dense timber, where he thought he had seen the dark form moving away through the trees, the man shrugged, started the big machine, and continued his work. Leveling the blade of the bulldozer, he slowly pushed his way deeper into the valley, deeper into the domain of the Shampe, completely oblivious of how close death had come to him that day. And that completes the prologue to my novel, The Shampe, Terror Has a Name. I hope you've enjoyed this reading. If you have, I'd encourage you to drop me a like, share, and subscribe. Leave a comment if you would, and let me know what you think of it. And like I say, I hope you enjoy it. And I'll leave a link in the description if you'd like to order this book and read the story in its entirety. So that being said, until next time, you guys take care.